Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our panel discussion on what's next for early years music. Thank you very much for coming on what is here at least a very chilly Saturday morning. I'm Vanessa Stansel. I'll be chairing our session today. I'm an early years music teacher and PhD student and work as a creative producer for the charity Creative Futures and as curator of the London Early Years Music Network for Sound Connections. And thank you very much also to the ISM Trust for programming this session and for giving early years a platform. We've got lots to talk about this morning. Please do make use of the Slido function to send in your questions, and we'll get to those in the last part of the session. But for now, I'll hand over to our panel to introduce themselves. Professor Nate Holder.
Hi everyone, I'm Professor Nate Holder. I'm currently Service Professor at the Royal Northern College of Music. I'm also a musician and an author, and yeah, my whole purpose is really trying to make the world of music education as equitable as possible.
Katie Nielsen.
Hello everybody, I'm Katie. I teach music in Hertfordshire. I work for the Voices Foundation as a practitioner who supports non-specialist and specialist music teachers all the way through from early years all the way up to the end of Key Stage 2. I run my own early childhood music practice. I've recently studied for an MA with Jess in Birmingham at CREC in early childhood music. Thank you.
Dr. Jessica Pitts.
Morning everybody, it's such a pleasure to be here, and I'm an early childhood music educator. I work part-time at the Royal College of Music as a music education lecturer, and I'm involved in the MA in Early Years Music Education that is run through the Centre for Research in Early Childhood in Birmingham, and do some freelance research and evaluation as well.
Amy Tushney.
Hello there, everyone. I'm Amy. I am a vocals practitioner and also a Kodai teacher.
And Dr. Susan Young.
Hello, I'm Susan Young. I'm retired now, but for 20 years I worked in universities as an academic, specialising in music education. And before that, for 20 years, I was a teacher.
Thank you so much all for being here. It's really lovely to be here talking with you. So to start, when we talk about early years music, that can mean a lot of different things to different people. Jess, I wonder, would you just be able to sort of set out for us a little bit everything that early years music can encompass?
Yeah, thanks Vanessa. So yeah, I just thought it might be helpful to start with a brief overview of the kind of terrain of early childhood. Many people sort of think initially that it's children aged 3 to 5 years, but music educators working in early childhood are thinking really across the birth to 5 life phase, certainly in England. But in many European countries, early childhood is considered birth to 8 years. And indeed, I believe in Scotland, in this new Realising the Ambition, they're beginning to think about the 0 to 8 age phase as one phase. So transitions then begin to look very differently, because it's not like making a big change from early years into Key Stage 1. It's seen much more smoothly as a whole life phase. The skills required to work as an early childhood music educator across this really formative life phase are very sophisticated and quite myriad. Yet to work in this sector, there is no required formal qualification. There are lots of informal networks now across the country, regional networks, but the work can be quite insular, often covering if you're going into school for teachers' PPA time. So there's little opportunity to share practice and very little opportunity for joint working. Because there's no core funding, music provision is very patchy. Some young children and families have no access to music participation, as they may not be able to afford to pay to attend a private music class, and the recently funded project in their town or their rural community may have just finished. This is a rights issue. All young children should have access to arts and cultural experiences. This is one of the articles of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. And I'm afraid we are failing our young children and families in this regard. The early childhood education world is also really difficult to navigate and understand. There's statutory provision in a nursery setting in a school, but there's also a proliferation of private, voluntary, independent daycare settings for children from around 6 months of age. There's high quality education from nursery schools. They're staffed by qualified teachers, but they are under threat because government funding for 2- and 3-year-olds doesn't cover the true cost of operating such high quality settings. And then we have children's centres, which offer this wonderful holistic health, social care and education all under one roof. And they've been declining in recent years. And music activities used to take place quite a lot there, free of charge for all families. And then, of course, we have childminders. These are Ofsted inspected and are also working on their own. So we've got a very patchwork situation, but all are working with the same early years, foundation stage, statutory curriculum and framework. And similarly, in the other countries in the UK have similar guiding documents. Practitioners work extremely hard. They are very low paid. They have very low status in society, and that means that they are often very lacking in confidence when it comes to things like working with music. And music educators often encounter this very low levels of confidence. So it's a really sensitive approach needed to empower and equip these practitioners to work with music in their settings. And we have to be careful that we don't de-skill and disempower people when we begin to work with them in those contexts. And if I may, talk a little bit about some models of practice that one can encounter in early childhood. If I say early childhood music education, I wonder what image you might have in your mind right now. Whether it's a group of children sitting in a circle looking up at the adult. This is exactly what I was brought in to deliver as an early childhood music expert for years and years, and this model is still prevalent. But it's based on particular ideas about what music teaching and learning should look and sound like. In this image, the children could be seen as having little or no knowledge about music, and they look to the adult expert to transfer this knowledge to them. The nursery practitioners can assess and they can measure this learning because each child gives you visible and audible signs through their imitation. So this is a model really of music education as training. And in my view, this works for some of the children some of the time. It can exclude children quite early on, and it can perpetuate an idea that music requires an expert to lead and facilitate learning. But it does teach children to pitch match, to keep steady beat, and to listen carefully, so it has a lot of value. But there are other models. Maybe the image of a child sitting together with their key workers, singing songs together at the start of the day or at snack time. These songs might mark transitions. They help to regulate the day. This is music education as a community, cultural activity, a model of guided participation into a culture. It can be dependent, though, on practitioners' willingness to sing and their knowledge of repertoire, and maybe their willingness to invite songs from home so that everyone can be integrated. So that requires real sensitive working from a trusted music educator to enable this practitioner to grow from that familiar to open more opportunities for musicking. And then an image of a child outdoors playing with a stick on a tree, vocalizing to themselves as they tap rhythmically, dance with their bodies. And a music educator could see this activity, come over, join, tap and join in this call and response game. The child can lead the game by moving to tap in different places in the outdoors, jumping, stopping, laughing, showing their enjoyment. And the music facilitator can follow their lead, both of them shaping the piece in this temporal sphere with reciprocity. So that's a model of music education as being in the world together. This subtle one-to-one practice might not be seen as worthwhile by settings who may be buying in the services of the music specialist and want the whole group of children to be prepared and to be able to sing and perform nursery rhymes to meet the early learning goals. And yet this model fits most neatly with the play-based curriculum that's recommended for the early years foundation stage. So I'm left wondering whether what children most benefit from as creative beings might not always be what they get, and how models of music education can include some and exclude some children from feeling like musicians before they even arrive at school. So I'll finish there, Vanessa.
Jess, there was an enormous amount of complexity there. I was really interested in that you mentioned PPA and, you know, musicians working in this insular way, but yet also the need for knowledge of the EYFS and to work sensitively with others. I wonder then, Katie, what do you think are the implications for what the role of the early years music practitioner is, or perhaps should be?
Yes, thanks, Vanessa. So yeah, as Jess has said, historically and currently in many cases, the role of the early years music practitioner is that they come in and they do music. They do music, and the early years practitioners, I'm talking about non-specialists here, I'm talking about the people that are there day in, day out with these children, kind of almost are allowed to abdicate from responsibility of music because somebody comes in and does it. And I think we need to rethink really the role of the early years music practitioner and see that role as much more collaborative with the non-specialists in the setting. And of course, when we're working with parent and child classes, which is something that I'm very interested in, we need to see the parents as our collaborators in that situation. Because again, they're the people that are day in, day out with the children. They know the children really well, and they're there when those children are being musical throughout the day. So this idea of collaborative working, I think, is really, really important. And there are two reasons in my mind for that. The first one is, as you might expect, these early years music practitioners can support the early years non-specialists. And they can do that by training. They can do it by working with these early years practitioners. And I think it would be really interesting to think about the fact that those early years practitioners are already using music every day. It's happening all the time. They use them for time to wash our hands songs and goodbye songs and hello songs, and when it's somebody's birthday, and music is happening whether we like it or not, all the way through the week for those children. And that's what we can know on one hand, but on the other hand, those practitioners, if you talk to many of them, they might tell you that they're not musical. And that seems to be quite often something somebody would say, oh yeah, I do music with the kids because I kind of have to, but I'm not musical. I don't read music, or I don't play an instrument, or I can't sing, or something like that. You hear that from lots and lots of general practitioners. But as someone who's looked into this and researched this, and I'm sure lots of you will agree, that just isn't true. In fact, we're all musical. When somebody says they're not musical, what they probably mean is they don't sing to a professional standard, or they don't play an instrument to a professional standard. But we are all innately musical. We're born musical. Our children are musical. And so for the early years practitioner, part of their role is to build the confidence of the non-specialists and help them to recognise what they can do. And alongside that, to develop their skills, knowledge and subject kind of vocabulary, so that they are a little bit more conscious of the musicianship that they actually have innately. Those practitioners are the ones that are going to be there when the children are playing in the sandpit or playing on the bike and being musical as they do those things. And as an early years music practitioner, chances are we're not going to have that opportunity because we only go in for a brief moment. So if we can work with the early years practitioners, that's going to be brilliant. The other important thing I would say, the other reason, which is maybe less obvious, is that we need to learn from early years practitioners, and we need to be humble, really, and learn from them, because they know the children, and they know those children's cultural background, and they know what happened yesterday, and they know what upset that child, and they know them incredibly well. So they're going to be better placed than we are to respond musically to those children. Also, they're very highly skilled when it comes to the early years foundation stage curriculum, and they can think about how music can be placed across the whole curriculum. And I'm not talking about music serving a song about something. I'm talking about how it is actually rooted in all areas of the curriculum. And finally, I suppose, good for our early years music practitioners to think about learning from the children, because children, they are musical, they're born musical, they have rich musical experience themselves, they have musical taste, and we shouldn't ever assume those children are empty vessels we need to put information into. We need to be learning from the early years practitioners, we need to be supporting the early years practitioners, but we also need to be learning from the children. I hope that's that sort of answered your question, Vanessa. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think lots of enormously valuable points there. You mentioned the musician only having, you know, this brief moment of time, and I suppose ultimately that comes down to, you know, the funding and resource that is put into the work, you know, as Jess mentioned as well, the sort of chronic underfunding. So the question then is, how do we make the case for more money and resources to be put into early years music? Sue, how can we go about doing that? What are some of the sort of challenges and tensions that we find?
Oh dear. Well, I'll do my best to address that. So can I say, first of all, thank you very much to the ISM for making this opportunity possible. It's very unusual for early childhood music educators to find ourselves talking to an audience of over 300 people, even though we can't see you out there. As an early childhood music education academic, I'm accustomed to talking to usually only about 3 people, not 300. If I go to a mainstream music education conference to present, I don't gather much interest because young children are, well, they're very small. They can't do very much musically, especially not babies. Secondary music education typically takes centre stage in music education conversations, and work with birth to 5-year-olds is marginal. And let's face it, as Jess said, it's low status. Likewise, if I go to a general education conference to present, I don't gather much interest either, because music is, well, a narrow, specialist and marginal subject in the wider educational picture. So this marginalisation, both in terms of music and the age stage of the children, is what I call the double whammy that early childhood music education suffers from. As a result of low status and low value, the early childhood music education sector has to do its best in the face of serious under-resourcing. And hence, as just described, it's become the patchwork of provision and practices that we have now. Stating it plainly, there is no government funding, no requirements for formal qualification to practice, anybody can do it and they do, and no systems of regulation. The result of this double whammy is that early childhood music education attempts to gain value vicariously by attaching itself to what is accorded more value and more status. So the focus becomes music in early childhood merely as preparation, as a foundation for what comes later, for the serious, proper music education that follows. Or it attaches itself to the other areas of learning that currently have greater value in the education system, an education system which sees education merely in terms of employability. So much effort is given to either demonstrating how early childhood music education can provide a firm foundation for formal music learning, which is why music as play, which Jess talked about, is poorly appreciated, or how it can benefit other areas of the curriculum, that are prioritised, such as reading and maths. So because it tries to seek vicarious value, there is an emphasis on how early childhood music education can be a servant to other areas of the curriculum. Currently, for example, there's interest in how music instruction can benefit children's reading. So I was interested to go back to a big review of music and reading studies, a meta-analysis carried out in 2008, 12 or 13 years ago now, by Jane Stanley. She gathered up 30 studies. There were 30 studies even then, going back to the 1960s. Most of these studies showed a modest, yes, it's true, but not insignificant positive effect of music on reading ability. Interestingly, and we should take note of this, the published studies showed a greater effect than unpublished studies. So in other words, we hear more about that which has a positive bias. There's already a positive bias in what gets published and disseminated. So my point is that the evidence is there. More than 50 years of evidence and well over 30 studies of how music can benefit other areas of learning, if that's what we think is important. What this shows us is that that kind of evidence doesn't convince. It doesn't change policy. And for that, to understand why that is, we have to go deeper into the beliefs and values that prevent change. What are the reasons why music is not higher on the music curriculum? Why are young children not part of the music education agenda, not higher on the music education agenda? So the focus on benefits connects with what many now refer to as the impact agenda or the impact culture. Many of you will recognise impact from the focus by Ofsted, intention, implementation and impact, and the focus on providing evidence of impact in funded projects. A focus on impact, however, narrows the discussion. It sidesteps the more important, but also much more difficult debate about values and purposes. It doesn't ask us to dig down into our assumptions, our beliefs. It doesn't raise the difficult and critical questions. And my response, by the way, is not to call up the music for music's sake rationale, which is often positioned as the opposite of music for benefits. That's also a very narrow argument. Rather, it is the narrow and technocratic scope, the focus on instrumentality that impact has acquired in policy thinking and the practice that it gives rise to that is problematic. To say nothing, by the way, of how the impact culture encourages the giving of inflated estimates of gains. So I ask that we push beyond the narrow culture of impact, outcomes and benefits, and ask the knotty questions about value and purpose. And this will link with what I say a little bit later about where next when I look to the future. So I leave those thoughts in the air and hand you back to Vanessa. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Some really thought-provoking questions there for all of us. Post-pandemic, in my experience, I've noticed, in fact, that the hierarchy of subjects you mentioned, you know, and the music's been pushed even further down the agenda in this sort of catch-up narrative. I wonder, Amy, what has your experience been of the sort of impact of the pandemic?
Thank you, Vanessa. So yeah, obviously the pandemic's had a huge impact on all of us, and I'm just going to speak a little bit from the perspective of my work as a musicianship tutor and a vocal specialist, and then from a personal perspective as a parent of a young child on the barriers to participation that I've encountered. So on the first point, I think it's really important to recognise that the pandemic has had a massive impact on music education. Certain things it's just not really possible to teach well online, and unfortunately certain elements of music come under that umbrella. Thus we're up against this catch-up culture where music has been sidelined. I've been back in schools and various educational settings since we've been allowed to teach in person again. And one thing that I found really interesting is that rhythmic work seems to have been quite successful online, but that pitching has become really weak. So on reflection, this isn't really surprising. Children learn to sing in tune by singing together in groups and singing with others. And there's something about the online thing where we just don't match to a voice the same way that we do in person, presumably to do with sound being compressed and so on. So children are coming into class pitching poorly, and they're less aware of their pitching in relation to others. So we're effectively having to learn to pitch match almost from scratch with much older children than we would expect to. There's also, I would say, a general fear of singing, which is still hanging around from when we all feared that singing was a super spreader. So there's a bit of fear there and a general lack of confidence. I suspect as a vocal practitioner that this is also reflective of the general decline in singing that we've been seeing over a number of years. So children are generally becoming less able by the time they get to the age of around about 8, which I think is probably due to a number of factors. One is cultural, that we simply don't sing as much anymore. Parents don't sing with their children in the way that perhaps they used to. And we've become a society where singing is for the talented, in inverted commas, rather than a community or a family activity. As a singing teacher, I've also observed a change in the way that we sing. So we're pitching everything lower. Popular media, i.e. Disney movies and so forth, are following that trend too. Singing is tending more towards a belting quality, and that feeds through right down to early years. I have been in so many early years settings where the adults are simply pitching too low for the children to match them accurately, or are singing along to recordings rather than a real live human voice. So it's a real battle to develop that at the moment. So on to my second point on the impact of COVID on participation and barriers to participation. So for context, I have a little one who is about to turn 1, can't believe it. So for the first time, I've been navigating this landscape as a parent rather than as a practitioner, and it's been really eye-opening for me. So particularly at the pre-nursery stage at the moment, I think there are huge barriers to participation in place, some of which have always been there, but which have been exacerbated by the pandemic, and some of which are a direct result of COVID. So firstly, from talking to other mums and from what I can gather, cost is a huge issue at the moment. Most classes have a fee. And most things also require to be paid up front and termly. People are asking for 6, 8, 10 weeks of classes to be paid, which is obviously a problem for many families, particularly post-COVID and in the current climate where people are struggling. Access and restricted numbers is a big issue. So for example, up here in Scotland, we have BookBug, which is absolutely brilliant, but there are far fewer sessions running and they book up straight away. So it's very hard to get a place. And those places are going to the most organised parents. So certain children are getting lots and certain children are getting nothing. Coverage, as has been said already, obviously I'm only speaking from my own experience here, but in Scotland it seems very patchy. The quality of classes varies wildly, and it's a bit of a postcode lottery as to what's available to parents. There's also an issue with quality. One early years class is not necessarily the same as another. I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted here, but there seems to be a number of franchises that have cashed in during the pandemic on parents' desire to take their child to a music session and are delivering music sessions that are not based on sound pedagogy and knowledge of child development. Parental lack of knowledge and understanding. So what I mean by that is a couple of things. One is due to isolation. So new parents in particular at the moment just don't have the networks that they would have had pre-COVID. I don't have a network of mum friends really. And while that's easing now, it's still very difficult to find information on sessions to take part in. And parents often just don't know what's out there. Secondly, I'm finding that parents just don't know what makes a good session. One mum I chatted to stopped taking her little one to a class because she thought it was too repetitive and too simple. And if you're not a musician or an educator, how do you know what makes a good class? How do you find that out when there's no regulation of what's out there? There's no easy access to that information. And marketing is a really powerful thing. From the practitioner's point of view, these things have also applied with the added difficulty of trying to keep on top of changing restrictions, the logistics of cleaning instruments, reducing class sizes, maintaining social distancing, which is incredibly difficult with little ones, difficulties with venues are afraid to commit, plus the loss of income that people have been seeing from sickness, having to isolate, and the resultant loss of momentum in sessions. During lockdown, there was the difficulties of trying to engage with families online, the high demand that we had to cope with when things first lifted, and now that reluctance to commit as a result of fearing another lockdown. And I suspect there's also been a loss of workforce as a result. So hopefully that helps answer that question a little bit, Vanessa.
Thank you so much. A lot of that resonates with my experience both professionally and as a parent as well. The question of inclusion and barriers to access is obviously a really important one, which also, you know, relates, Nate, a lot to your work. It's always been urgent, but global events have perhaps given a wider public attention, if you like, to sort of questions around decolonizing and anti-racist practice and how we can move forward in that way. What are your thoughts on sort of, you know, how we can look to the future there?
Thank you for having me. Just to start off with, the thoughts for looking to the future. I think sometimes it's important to not just look to the future, but look to the past and understand, you know, why we do what we do and how we do what we do. Looking at the landscape of this country and all other countries, you know, people who were here listening, and really figuring out what this thing, boiling it down to its, as much as we can, to its bare essentials, thinking about what this thing called music really is, who it's really for, who it has been for, and then trying to get an understanding of that moving forward to making music, allowing music to be made and to be interacted with, to be assessed in a more equitable way. A lot of my work tries to look at these issues, tries to look at how we can change perceptions of music. I think it's very, very, very interesting and important that we, again, not only think about what we can do moving forward, but thinking about how we were brought up in the many different areas of life that, for many different reasons, as soon as we enter into certain spaces, we don't take in all our experience, not because we can't and not because we don't have experiences and musical experiences, valuable and life-changing in different ways, musical experiences, but because the setups in certain spaces don't allow for us to bring that. And a couple of panelists have already alluded to, you know, these ideas of input extraction. Paulo Freire talks about this idea of, you know, the banking system where we feel like we have to input all of this information into young children, you know, forgetting about the fact that children are developing their ears from before they're born, right? So there's so much information there that they're trying to understand that in many different ways we don't allow them to understand because we're too busy trying to give them things that we feel like they need, things that we can easily assess for many, many different reasons. And so I think thinking about, you know, the impact of COVID, even how, you know, many different people from different backgrounds have been affected by COVID. Again, you know, everyone has pretty much said so much of what I would say, which is great, I think, because I think it means that there's a lot of us thinking in similar ways, coming from different angles, but thinking in very similar ways. So I think part of the beauty of being in these spaces right now is that we understand that many people are thinking in similar ways. And so thinking about how we can band together and actually work together in more concerted and more specific areas. For example, thinking about diversity, there's a report was published admittedly a few years ago in 2017, which said that only 0.09% of children's books about music had any Black or brown representation in them. It is 0.09%, which, you know, I don't, and to be perfectly honest with you, apart from the work that I've done, I'm not particularly sure of how many other books have been published since then in the last 4 or 5 years, which increased that. So there has definitely been an increase, but I have no idea about the data. And I suspect that the reason why there isn't that much more data is because the number is so low. So is there any point to, you know, to continue to look into that, right? So I think we have a massive problem in that, knowing that there are the demographics of this country has shifted. Pedagogy, which has underpinned so much of this work, has been situated in a certain period of time, even if it was 20, 30 years ago, not hundreds of years ago. And because of that, because of the shifting of demographics, what folk music might mean, what popular music might mean to different people, what lullabies even might mean to different people, what nursery rhymes might mean to different people has changed and is different for many different groups. But still, this idea that, you know, there's this one type of music which fits all, I think, still pervades, and which perpetuates the feelings that many people have of spaces not being for them. which is why there might be less uptake in people from many different backgrounds coming to certain classes, because they perceive it's not for them, because they are not represented in the literature, they're not represented in the music and workforce as well. They don't see anyone who looks like them, who they feel like their child is going to learn from, not just music but in other areas of life, because we all know, birth to 5, there are many children who are trying to figure out who they are, their identities, their cultural identities, their gender. There's many children who are in these spaces who are trying to figure it out. And if there aren't enough people who understand certain elements and ask certain questions and represent people in certain ways, it becomes very difficult for children then to, as soon as they leave early year settings, to then be free and confident to ask the questions when for years potentially they haven't felt like they can, or they haven't seen the people around them to be able to understand that there are differences and we need to celebrate all those different differences. So I could go on, but I know we're pressed for time today. But I think it's important as we move forward to really consider all of these different factors, and it's a process of learning, relearning, rethinking, and understanding who we are as people, because we don't come into spaces as almost like a default human being with no cultural or experience. We come with everything that we've experienced in our whole lives. And it's important, I think, that as we move forward, we understand who we are, we understand what we bring, and then be able to create spaces where we're able to share what we bring, and hope and allow children, and especially their parents at particular ages, to then bring themselves into spaces. And then by default, we'll start to create spaces which are more multicultural, which are more diverse, which are more inclusive. And I think we can only do that, again, if we're speaking to each other in situations like this and really challenging ourselves, not just in a professional way, but in a personal way as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Again, just enormously thought-provoking, and really this question of what is music, and really picking that apart. And I suppose a lot of, what we bring to it comes back a little bit to Sue's question about sort of asking those big questions about values and purpose as well. I suppose to finish then, Sue, what do you think are some other important priorities for the futures, and how can we make sort of early years music try to be a vehicle for positive change?
So where to next for early childhood music education?
Quite.
And so I finished before with a request that we move beyond the narrow culture of benefits and the narrow culture of impact and outcomes. And I was busy trying to scribble down a few of the things that Nate said in order to lead on from that. And I'll be able to hopefully bring those in a moment. As is obvious from what we've heard from our other speakers, we face a present of many challenges, a pandemic, can't even say the word, pandemic, which is still with us, unfortunately, climate emergency, an increasingly divided society with high levels of poverty. The pandemic could be a point at which we break with the past, not going back to normal, whatever normal is or was, a point at which we demand radical change, a demand that for a music education that is about caring for one another, which is about equality, for community cohesion, and also for caring for the planet and all its living things. Joy from music involvement in the here and now, not empty joy from buying more extracted high carbon footprint stuff on Black Friday and fueling capitalism that has got us into this mess in the first place. That is what music is good for. The meaningfulness of musical participation, the playfulness of music made with others. Gert Biester, an education philosopher, talks of a world-centered education, and I think we need a world-centered, a community-centered music education, not subject-centered, not child-centered, but world-centered. So my next point, we need educated educators. Educated within standardized qualifications to be creative and critical thinkers, and hopefully also to be able to spot pseudoscience a mile away. And can I also add, let's please talk about educators, because that is what we are, and refer to educating and not training. Training implies that teaching is merely a technical process. There are European countries, for example, where an MA is required, a master's degree is required to work at the level of early childhood in recognition of just how skilled the work is and the high level of knowledge required. So qualifications and expectations of high levels of practice, please, is one thing. Another thing I would add is awareness of the political context and how neoliberalism and neoconservatism are currently shaping music education. We are led to believe that music education, particularly music education for early childhood, is very far removed from politics. But this is how it is powerfully repoliticized in a form which wants us to believe that we are powerless to affect change and that there is no alternative to what we have now. The pandemic has shown us very clearly that there are alternatives. The government can act to effect change very quickly when they want to. Money can be found, lots of it, when there are priority needs. And so finally, we must aim for real structural change, transformation which starts at the level of deep set values, attitudes and assumptions. And as Nate said, looking back and challenging those assumptions that we bring with us and that asking the difficult and knotty questions before we think forwards, aiming towards a truly democratic education, working for the social good, for the common good, not classes for profit or economic advantage. And please, not just tweaks and moving around deck chairs, but bold and brave discussions about what an ideal early childhood music education would, should, and could be. There we go, Vanessa, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We have a number of questions, so I think we'll move swiftly onto those. Unsurprisingly, on the basis of all those wonderful contributions, thank you so much for all your thoughts. It's been really, really fascinating. Thank you to everybody. We have a first one here that I think might be useful for lots of people, which is how can we provide good quality early years music education when the level of government funding is so low? And perhaps a related question, which is, I work in childcare. Where would you suggest I look for good quality early years music resources? Perhaps, Jess, would you like to?
Yeah, I mean, I was just sort of pondering a really, you know, none of us really wanted to put our hand up to answer that question because that is the problem. You know, there is no really easy solution. If there isn't the continual funding, core funding, and a real sort of commitment to funding a music education for young children, you know, of course quality is compromised. You know, it's just as simple as that. But there are regional networks, and you know, anyone working or interested in early years, it is really worth connecting to the regional networks. So you know, there's note weavers in the northeast, there's the East of England Forum, there's the Southwest. The Southwest has got Soundwaves network. There are networks actually of really skilled expert practitioners who meet together and share. So it is really worth connecting into those networks, and they do offer quite a lot of sort of sharing sessions, which are, you know, completely free to join. So I recommend that. I'm a trustee of a national charity called MERIC England, Music Educators and Researchers of Young Children. We have a seminar series, online seminar series, throughout the year, and conferences as well for people that really are interested in thinking about the intersections of research and practice. So those would be places that I'd recommend people sort of connect in with to get a variety of approaches, because I think, you know, that we've heard, haven't we, that there are different models that suit different sorts of contexts, and I think to have a range of approaches that are going to work in different contexts is broadening and deepening, rather than saying, well, I just want to follow one pathway. I think having a broad approach is really valuable, and to meet with people that perhaps don't think like you, that can be really helpful in helping you think differently.
Thank you. Yeah, Nate, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, just really quickly. The question is, how can we provide good quality EY music education when the level of government funding is so low? I think I have to ask the question, well, what does quality mean? Like, what are you defining as quality? You're asking to find good quality early years music resources. What does quality mean? I think we really ask ourselves, what are we actually getting at here? What does the quality mean? Yeah, that's just the question I think I throw back.
Yeah. Jess.
Just sort of coming in quickly on that. I mean, that's so absolutely, Nate. I mean, quality is not a neutral term. Quality isn't a term that everyone understands to be the same. Quality is always filtered through our own perceptions and understandings of what music might look like, of what music is. And I think, you know, that is absolutely right, that we really have to think, what are we really talking about when we're talking about quality? Because quality for a child might not be what we would think of as maybe necessarily a music lesson. You know, quality music experience for a child might be being observed, listened to, weighted, and then, you know, their activities fed back to them. I mean, it's to do with sensitivity. It's to do with attunement to the children that you're with. It's to do with things that are maybe not always tangible and visible. It's those skills of pedagogy that are actually what's needed with nonverbal children, that ability to tune into the moment and to be, well, those kairos, fleeting moments where you can intervene at a moment that makes an amazing change for somebody. That can be a quality moment. So it's you're so right about questioning quality. Thank you.
Thank you. We've got another question asking, what role can early years practitioners play in supporting and encouraging parents to be musical with their children? Katie, would you like to say something about this?
Yeah, this is something that I'm very, very interested in. And first of all, I think it's worth sort of saying, maybe we need to just rethink everything. So we need to go down the route that Susan talked about, just being really radical here. Maybe it isn't about us teaching parents how to be musical with their children at all, but maybe we need to stop and realise that, once again, I'll say it again, we're all musical, and we need to recognise what parents are doing already with their children. They're being incredibly musical with their children. It's innate, it's instinctive, it's just something, part of the way they bring up their children. And so maybe as practitioners, we need to first of all recognise that, and then think about how we can work with parents to develop their skills and to develop that musical existence for our children, that musical environment, rather than teach parents how to be musical with their children. I mean, I'm not suggesting the questioner was saying that, but there is a little bit of a culture and climate in our country at the moment where people are trying to teach parents how to be parents, and I'm just wondering whether we need to rethink how we sort of go about all that sort of thing.
Amy.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you, Katie. I think it comes down to confidence. I think we have a real cultural issue where people think that you are either musical or you're not. They think that people seem to think that being musical is something that, you know, as you said at the start, like, is being trained, as being a professional musician. And what it's done is it's taken parents away from following their own instincts with their children. I think, you know, I've observed just from the last year as a new parent, quite a lot of people are playing things on their phones to their children of other people singing rather than just singing to them, because they don't believe that their own voices are good enough. And I think that's incredibly sad. So I think as a practitioner, our role is to try and equip those parents with the confidence to trust themselves a bit more, you know, and trust that what they have to offer is worthwhile and valid, and they can do so much without being trained how to do it.
Thank you. let's try and fit one more question in. Ofsted inspect the early years, and I have some concerns that the focus in reception is unrealistic and does not recognise the rich musical learning you describe. Do you have thoughts? I think referring to the early learning goals, presumably. So,
well, I mean, I can answer that very simply. I mean, I just agree. Yes, their focus is unrealistic, and it's they're very interested in phonics and these early skills of reading and language, and they're not recognizing, they're not well equipped as inspectors to understand the nature of children's learning and reception. So yeah, I just agree with that.
Well, we probably can fit one more then in. Someone's asked Nate if you could say a little bit more about extraction, because that feels like a key concept, which is something I think you mentioned in relation to sort of transactional ideas of sort of input and.
Yeah, I think the way I kind of approach it is from a bit of post-colonial theory. So it's thinking about the ways in which there is already information in a child, specifically in this case, a child's head, but yet when they walk into a classroom or into a space, it doesn't become about what they know or what they've experienced. It becomes about, you know, learning these notes or learning this song or learning how to sing in this particular way. And so I think that that combined with ideas around culturally relevant pedagogy, I think really helps us to try and understand and help children to express what's in their minds, what they already experience, what they understand, what they know, and to some extent what they want to know. And then it helps us as educators to provide resources which cater to that, which it helps us to develop courses or programs which help educators to help to get that information out of children and helps them to understand what's going on in their homes, helps them to understand what's going on in their churches, what helps them to understand what's going on, going on when they listen to TV or music on TV or radio or whatever. It's all of that. So yeah, in summation of that, it's really just about thinking about what does a child already bring, and how can we help them and develop that and help them to understand what that is, rather than assuming that they know nothing when they come into a class or into a setting.
Thank you. Thank you so much to everybody that's sent questions. I think we'll probably start to wrap it up there. Thank you so much also to all of the panel for your thoughts. I suppose briefly summing up, what I've heard is an enormous amount of challenge at the moment through sort of double whammy, but also an enormous amount of potential and some, a sector that's really lucky to have such critical thinking like this, that's led a session towards really big questions of, what is music, questioning our identity and what it is to be human and to live in the world. And, a way of working that also potentially has a lot to offer other ages of music education in thinking, more broadly about the child and children's identity and the political context in which we work, which is, important for any, not even music education, actually, any form of education really. But also some really good practical ideas that people can go away with, which is also nice to leave with. So a few of them have been mentioned. We will be putting them together and they will be emailed out afterwards. So Jess mentioned there are regional networks who are a great first port of call for CPD, sort of networking and contact. There's Merrick, which Jess mentioned as well, which is Music Educators and Researchers of Young Children, who have a series of conferences. And then there's also the Centre for Research in Early Childhood, who also offer the CME in early years music, as well as an MA. So there's lots of, sort of, and Musical Development Matters is a resource that's really worth mentioning as well. So there's lots of support out there and lots of good practical things that people can go and look up to connect with other people and hopefully try and start putting into practice or start thinking about some of these sort of big questions that we've raised today. So the next session that will be happening is at 12:15, which just leaves you time to go and get a cup of coffee, and that is, does music education have a future in England? And so with that, just thank you very much to everybody for joining us once again this morning and for sending in all your questions and participating. An enormous thank you very much for your thoughts to our panel, to Professor Nate Holder, to Katie Nielsen, Dr. Jessica Pitt, Amy Toshny and Dr. Susan Young. Thank you so much. Goodbye. Have a lovely morning.